The Ruskin Cave Recreational Park in Tennessee might look beautiful on the outside, but there have been strange reports from employees and hikers around the area of strange sounds at night they can't explain. Today's story is about a previous park staff who, after moving into the grounds, lived a horrific nightmare that her own daughter refuses to speak about to this day. You won't want to miss this one. In the summer of 1987, a 36-year-old woman named Cheryl and her 14-year-old daughter moved to Dickson County, Tennessee to work at Ruskin Cave Recreational Park. The park sits on top of what locals called the mountain, with both Ruskin Cave and Jewel Cave carved into its limestone heart. And the mother, who had taken a job as part of the park's staff, was given living quarters right on the grounds with the other staff. Now, the mother was actually pretty excited about this new chapter. The living quarters were comfortable enough, and they had everything they needed: a kitchen, bedrooms, and windows that looked out over the scenic cave grounds. And so, for the first few weeks, everything was completely normal. The mother would work her shifts at the park, her daughter would go to school, and they'd spend their evenings together in their little home on the cave grounds. Around the property was quite large, with wooded areas surrounding the caves, a natural spring, and this beautiful creek that ran right through Ruskin Cave. One night in July, the mother was sitting at her kitchen table going through some paperwork from the day's tours when she heard a car pulling up to the park's main gate. It was about 10:30 p.m., and her daughter was getting dropped off from a local softball game. And normally, the mother wouldn't think twice about her daughter walking from the gate to the quarters. I mean, it was a short walk she'd done a dozen times before. The mother could see through her window as her daughter, still in her softball uniform and carrying this big bag of candy she'd bought from the concession stand, started making her way down the path that ran right alongside the creek. The creek was actually quite loud at night, and the sound of running water would just sort of echo off the cave walls and created this constant background noise that everyone who lived on the grounds had gotten used to. And so the mother went back to her paperwork, but just a few moments later, the front door burst open. Her daughter stumbled in, literally shaking and her face completely white. The bag of candy was gone, and there was something about her daughter's expression and body language that told Cheryl something was very wrong. Her daughter tried to speak, but no words would come out. She just stood there trembling with tears streaming down her face, and as Cheryl wrapped her arms around her daughter, she noticed her back was all scraped up, and her softball uniform was dirty, like she'd been knocked down. And as the mother was trying to calm her daughter down enough so she could explain what happened, something made her glance toward the window. And Cheryl began to scream while she clutched her daughter close to her. Standing there, looking directly in at them, was something so massive it blocked out most of the window frame. And this large shape moved away from the window seconds later. Cheryl and her daughter could hear something big moving around outside, and it was moving toward the front door. And so Cheryl immediately grabbed her daughter, and they ran to the back bedroom, barricading themselves inside while she frantically dialed the police. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to dial it twice, and the dispatcher could hear the panic in her voice as Cheryl tried to explain that something had attacked her daughter and was now outside their home. Well, the police arrived about 15 minutes later, and by then, whatever was outside was gone. Two officers walked the grounds with flashlights while Cheryl's daughter, still visibly shaken, tried to explain what had happened. She told them how she had been walking home, carrying her candy bag, when she heard these heavy splashing sounds in the creek beside her. And then something reached out from behind her, and she described it as that this massive hand tried to grab her candy bag. And when she pulled back, she was knocked to the ground, which explained the scratches and scrapes on her back. The officers, of course, searched the area thoroughly, but found something strange. Now, despite the ground being soft from recent rain, they couldn't find any distinct footprints, just these odd depressions in the mud right near the creek. They did, however, find the torn candy bags scattered along the path, and strangely, none of the candy was actually taken. Now, the senior officer, who'd worked in Dickson County for over 20 years, seemed particularly interested when Cheryl described what she'd seen at the window. He pulled his partner aside and they had this kind of hushed conversation that Cheryl couldn't quite hear. But she noticed how they kept looking back at her and her daughter with this concerned expression. The height of whatever was at the window had to have been at least 8 feet tall based on Cheryl's description. Way too tall for a person. Bears were common in the area, but bears don't reach through darkness to specifically grab bags, and they certainly don't peek through windows. Now, before leaving, one of the officers told Cheryl they might want to keep their windows locked for a while, especially after dark. The senior officer would later tell his wife that in all of his years of service, this was the first time he'd find a report and honestly had no idea how to classify what had happened. Well, a few nights after the incident, Cheryl and her daughter were just trying to get back to some sense of normalcy. They had this nightly ritual of sitting out on their front porch, sipping black tea, something they'd done since her daughter was little. And the tea was always served in these old ceramic mugs Cheryl's grandmother had given her, and normally this routine helped them both unwind from a long day. Now, from somewhere near the far edge of the property, past where Ruskin Cave opens up, came this sound that made them both freeze mid-sip. It wasn't like anything either of them had ever heard. It was this deep, guttural scream that seemed to kind of echo off the cave walls and bounced around the entire property. And it was so loud that even the crickets stopped making noise. Cheryl's daughter quickly grabbed her mom's arm so tight that tea spilt on the porch. The screaming continued, and it was getting closer. It wasn't just one continuous scream, but rather these series of roars that would start low and then build up to this horrible pitch. And their neighbor's dog, which normally barked at everything, was now whimpering and scratching at their door to be let in. And so Cheryl and her daughter rushed inside after their fight or flight senses kicked in, locked the door, and spent the rest of the night listening to these screams move around the property, getting closer at times and then fading away again. Well, that night, after the screaming finally stopped somewhere around 3 a.m, Cheryl managed to fall into an exhausted sleep on the couch where she'd been sitting with all the lights on. But her sleep was anything but peaceful. In her dreams, she kept seeing those massive hands she glimpsed at the window. Only now they were pushing through her daughter's bedroom window. And in these nightmares, Cheryl would try to run to her daughter's room, but her legs felt like they were moving through molasses. And then that scream would start again. Only this time it was coming from inside the house. And so she'd wake up drenched in sweat and lightheaded and immediately run to check on her daughter. Now, this happened 3 times that night, and by morning, despite the exhaustion, Cheryl set out in the light of morning to investigate near the creek after sending her daughter off to school. Near the creek where her daughter had been attacked, there were these large areas where the vegetation had been completely flattened, like something massive had been pacing back and forth all night, creating these almost perfect parallel paths through the tall grass. And there was this smell. It was like a mix between a wet dog and something else rotting. But what really got to her was finding one of her daughter's hair ties from the softball game lying in the middle of one of these paths. It was kind of stretched out like something huge had been playing with it. Now, Cheryl called in sick to work that day, and she just sat at her kitchen table, kind of just checking out, staring out the window at those flattened paths, jumping every time the wind moved the branches. Now, by this point, she hadn't slept properly in days, and the lack of sleep was really starting to affect her. Dark circles had formed under her eyes, and she started to notice her hands would shake every time she would hear a noise outside. The coffee maker in the kitchen had been running nonstop, and she was on her 6th cup by noon. And so, after picking her daughter up from school and making sure she was safely inside, Cheryl decided it was time to start asking around the neighborhood. I mean, even if people thought she was crazy, it didn't matter. Now, that afternoon, she drove down Yellow Creek Road and stopped at a small white farmhouse that she'd passed every day on her way to work. An elderly couple, the Johnsons, had lived there for over 40 years, and if anyone would know anything about what was happening near the caves, it would be them. Mrs. Johnson was hanging laundry when Cheryl pulled up, and the moment Cheryl mentioned the screams, the older woman's hands stopped mid-motion, still holding a wet sheet, and she called over her husband, and soon Cheryl found herself sitting at their kitchen table clutching a cup of coffee that Mrs. Johnson insisted she drink. I'm sure the 7th cup of coffee really didn't help Cheryl out here. Mrs. Johnson explained to Cheryl that they had been hearing those screams on and off for years now. In fact, the first time was back in 1952, right after they bought the place. And they initially thought it was a mountain lion, but as Mr. Johnson explained, mountain lions don't walk on 2 legs, and his wife kept nodding along as he spoke, just adding details about the little things they'd seen over the years. Now, strangely, Mrs. Johnson told Cheryl about their farm dogs and how these weren't just any dogs. These were animals that would chase off bears without hesitation, but there were certain nights where these same fearless dogs would suddenly start whimpering and hiding under the porch. And that's when they'd hear that same scream that started off far away, but would quickly move in and pace around their home. And at one point, Mrs. Johnson became very quiet, almost choked up. She brought up what happened to the tour guide at Jewel Cave, and apparently this woman named Sarah had been leading a group through the cave system last summer in 1986 when something began following them. According to Mrs. Johnson, Sarah had told her the thing stayed just at the edge of their flashlight beams, but they could all hear it splashing through the water. The entire tour group had ended up running out of the cave, and Sarah had quit that very day. Now, both caves, Ruskin and Jewel, were supposedly connected by underground passages. And now she was wondering if whatever had tried to grab her daughter was using those caves to move around the property. And so, as Cheryl was getting ready to leave, Mr. Johnson suddenly remembered something. He disappeared into their back room and came out with this old, worn, leather-bound journal. His father had been a surveyor for the caves back in the 1920s, and he'd kept detailed notes about everything he'd encountered. His hands were shaking slightly as he opened the journal to a very specific page. Well, Cheryl's coffee cup slipped from her hands and shattered on the floor. There, in faded ink, was a crude drawing of exactly what she'd seen at her window. This massive figure with a flat face and round eyes. And the notes beside it described the same coarse, bushy hair she'd seen, even down to the length of 2 to 3 inches. But despite everything that had happened recently, the date of the entry was July of 1927, exactly 60 years before her daughter's encounter. The surveyor had written about how these things seem to become more active in the summer and documented multiple instances of them trying to grab or lure children and teenagers. Always at night and always near water. Mrs. Johnson must have seen the color drain from Cheryl's face because she reached across the table and grabbed her hand. Now, she spoke to Cheryl softly and just said, "Honey, maybe it's time you and your daughter found somewhere else to live." But Cheryl knew it wasn't that simple. I mean, she had taken the job because they needed the money, and finding new work in Dickson County wasn't easy. I mean, besides, something in her gut told her that moving wouldn't solve the problem, because whatever this thing was, it had already noticed them. And so Cheryl drove home, and she was having the worst bouts of anxiety she'd ever had. The sun was setting, and she knew her daughter would be finishing up her homework by now. So when she pulled up to her quarters, she noticed something that nearly made her choke. There were wet footprints leading from the creek to her front door, and these were massive prints, fresh enough that they hadn't dried yet. And they weren't the kind that walked away from the door, they just stopped there as if whatever made them was still close by. So Cheryl sat in her car, the engine still running, staring at these wet footprints. Her daughter was inside, and every maternal instinct was screaming at her to run in there, but another part of her brain was just trying to process what she was seeing. Each footprint was easily twice the size of a man's boot, and there was something off about their shape, like whatever made them wasn't quite walking right. Cheryl's train of thoughts were shattered by the worst scream she'd heard yet. A different scream that wasn't coming from the woods or the caves, it was coming from inside her house. Cheryl grabbed the iron from her trunk and ran toward her front door. The screen was hanging off its hinges and she could hear what sounded like furniture being moved around inside. But she realized she was hearing her daughter's voice. She wasn't screaming, she was talking to something. And so Cheryl burst through the door and found her daughter standing in the middle of a living room, staring up at the ceiling. All the furniture had been pushed against the walls, like something had cleared a path to the room. And there was the smell, that same wet dog and rotting smell from the creek. It was overwhelming. Cheryl's daughter looked pretty disheveled, but not harmed. And without taking her eyes off the ceiling, she whispered cautiously to her mom that it's been up there in the crawl space and has been watching her. Cheryl slowly looked up, and there in the access panel to the attic crawl space, she could see these long, dark fingers curled around the edge of the opening. And as both mother and daughter stood in place, they could hear something much larger than any person slowly shifting its weight in the space above them. The tire iron in her hand suddenly felt useless as she realized just how massive whatever was up there had to be to even fit in that crawl space. The ceiling creaked again, and a few bits of drywall dust kind of sprinkled down, and her daughter, still staring up, whispered something that made Cheryl wince. "It's trying to take me." And then they heard this low guttural noise coming from above, but it wasn't a scream. It was like it was trying to speak. And the words were garbled and deep, like someone trying to talk underwater. And it was very similar to this kind of samurai chattering. Cheryl grabbed her daughter's arm and started backing them both toward the front door. But as they moved, the thing in the crawl space moved with them, following their path from above. The ceiling joists groaned under its weight. They were almost to the door when Cheryl's daughter stopped suddenly. Her daughter ushered her to look at the window, and when Cheryl turned her head slightly, her heart nearly stopped. There, pressed against the glass, was another face, flat, with those same round eyes she'd seen before, but this one was smaller, like a child version of what she had seen. And behind it, she could make out more shapes moving in the darkness, and the realization hit her. They weren't just dealing with one, they were dealing with an entire group or family. And for some reason, they had fixated on Cheryl's daughter. The ceiling access panel suddenly crashed down behind them, and without thinking, Cheryl shoved her daughter through the front door, slammed it behind them, and the sound of splintering wood erupted from inside their house as something huge dropped down from the crawl space. But they couldn't stop to look because now they could see shapes moving all around their yard, ducking between trees, all of them heading toward the house. Cheryl's car at this point was only 30 feet away, but it felt like miles. They sprinted across the grass, and Cheryl realized that some of these shadows weren't from the porch light at all. They were being cast by something much larger moving behind them. And just as they reached the car, she heard splashing sounds from the creek, the same sound her daughter had described the night she was attacked. The creek was alive with movement, like multiple things were emerging from the water all at once. They managed to get into the car just as something huge slammed against the driver's side window. Cheryl jammed the key into the ignition, floored it, gravel sprang as they tore out of there, and in the rearview mirror, she could see multiple large figures moving back toward the caves, just disappearing into the darkness. That was their last night at Ruskin Cave. They drove straight to a motel in Dixon and never went back to get their belongings. Cheryl called the park management the next morning and quit over the phone. When they asked her why the sudden decision, she refused to answer. A year later, in 1988, when investigators followed up on their encounter, they discovered something very interesting: that the entire area of Dixon County, Tennessee, had a long history of Bigfoot sightings, all describing creatures between 8 to 9 feet tall, with flat faces and round eyes, and covered in that same coarse, bushy hair. In fact, dozens of people in the surrounding neighborhoods had heard those same screams throughout that summer. And even now, hikers and cave explorers in Dixon County occasionally report hearing those same screams in and around the caves, especially on summer nights when the creek runs high. Cheryl's daughter still refuses to talk about what happened. And because you guys made it this far, I want you to comment below Tennessee, so that way I know who made it to the end and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy this kind of storytelling where we dive into strange cases of the mysterious and supernatural, then what are you waiting for? Slap that like and subscribe button for more content just like this. And as always, never forget, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next episode.